Now I move to Niyanthini. Now, Dr. Kaushal has stopped with tuitions, and you have studied free education, at PhD scale. Now, in Sri Lanka, while there's free education system, there's also associated costs like the tuition fees. So how should we look at it? Because at the same time, education is education to an extent. It's, some people pay for it because of the structure, some people get it free of charge. So whether do we have to focus on the free component of it or the quality, or at the same time, whether does it have to come with the choice aspect where you, because the IMF also somewhat badly commented about Sri Lanka's performance, because even on the social safety net, the money we haven't spent in total. So whether on free education, whether you make it free by funding more from the education budget to all schools, all teachers, or whether you give it by increasing the spending, but you give it to the end user, so then they have a choice to where to spend for it. With your research, I would like to explore more on this topic.
Yeah, thank you first for inviting me. And thank you to Sarah for an excellent report. I read the whole report. And I think you've raised a very important point about taxation, education. But I also noticed that in the report you're talking about inequality, right? And you've shown quite clearly how in Sri Lanka's post-independence period, we begin with trying to rectify or remedy some of the colonial policies which had sort of increased inequality, right? We had a dual two-tiered education system at that time through the colonial policy, and it was the implementation of free education, the act that was brought in 1945, was in a way to try and curb that inequality as well, right? We had Sinhala and Tamil medium schools, which were funded by the government, and then there were English medium schools, which were fee-levying schools, right? And it had caused this two-tier dual hierarchy within society. And the education system was in one way trying and address that. The second reason that free education was introduced in Sri Lanka was because the committee that was formed at that time felt that their task was to create a democratic society, right, and not a totalitarian society. And they argue in that report that came out in 1943, which was chaired by W.W. Kannangara, that for a democratic society, education has to be from primary all the way up to university, right? And they even said few would disagree with this premise, right? I think now we have come to a very different situation where even the question of, right, what is free education, is it freedom, is it choice, is being raised. In other words, I think people have shifted from that idea that in a democratic society, education has to be free at all levels, right? So that's the first point. And I think you showed how the education policy is not disconnected from the overall economic outlook in the report. And we see that in the first few decades post-independence, the overall economic policies focused a lot on social investment. It focused a lot on the agricultural, the rural economy. It focused on universal systems, food subsidies, free education, free health, subsidies on utilities, which are all thought of as universal, right? And we see that the impact is that there was less inequality, as you have shown in the report through the data. And then we come to 1977, there's of course a shift. We can ask why, right? Why we had to shift from a system that seemed to be kind of okay, but I think there were economic shocks that also led to this shift. And then we see that inequality is rising, right? And economic growth may have increased, and economists have shown that Sri Lanka had this unique model of low inequality, although there was modest economic growth at that time. then we do see that maybe there was economic growth, but inequalities rise. But along with it, there's a very new economic vision, which has ultimately brought us to the economic crisis that hit in 2022. The tax policies did have a role to play, but it was not just that. It was 5 decades of market-oriented policies, 5 decades of liberalization, trying to focus on the external markets. It was decades of dependence on debt, particularly foreign debt, and eventually private debt, right? And so throughout this time, we've seen the idea of, and the reason for why we have to have a public education system also shift. And I thought one aspect that is noteworthy in that post-97 period is that we also have, you've discussed a lot about the IMF in the report, but there were other IFIs, the World Bank particularly, and the Asian Development Bank, which have contributed the biggest chunk of the funding for education, right, in these last few decades. So if you ask the question, who is actually behind education reforms in this country in that period, unfortunately, it's not educators like Mr. Sivarajan. The culprits behind the education crisis that we have now are economists, right, unfortunately. Because economists have been the architects of and influencers of education policy in that period, and through the IFIs that have, come into this country, right? And so currently we are at a position where we've had an economic crisis. The data is glaring, right? And I think in the data, it's clearly shown that those who have actually benefited from the economic changes of the 1977, including with tax breaks, but also in terms of the model, are the rich, and the poor have lost. And so now the question is, we have an economic crisis. It seems like a huge shift now, like we experienced in 77. Who is going to benefit and who is going to lose, right? And in the last 3 years, we've already seen who has lost. I think the interviews show that. Mr. Sivarajendran just mentioned what's happening in schools shows that although in the media in the last few months, if you see, everybody is congratulating that the fact that Sri Lanka has done well, that we are stabilized and all that, but I think we need to ask the question, who has paid that cost, right? And I think education definitely is one of the areas that has completely suffered because of the economic recovery program, right? So in this context, how do we think about choice, right? How do we think about what type of education we need? Because it has been integrally part of the economic model. And the biggest exclusions in Sri Lanka's history of free education, of course, has been the Malayaha Tamil people. And the reason is because there were economic interests involved in that exclusion. At the time of the introduction of free education, the question of estate schools was left ambiguous, right? They didn't want to address it because they didn't want to upset the plantation capitalists at that time. We needed the labor for the economy, right? And so there was actually no motivation to educate the plantation workers' children, because there's always this fear, right? What if all these people get educated? Who's going to do those jobs for us, right? And so when you talk about choice, right? What choice does, and I did my field work in estate schools in your area, what choice does a child of a plantation laborer have in terms of education? Do they have any choice at all other than the free education, public schooling, with the inadequate resources that those schools have, right? And often in policy circles, our discussions have shifted to the sort of ambitions of middle-class families. I also think it's a class reaction, a counter-reaction to the fact that in Sri Lanka we've had, to a certain extent, children from all backgrounds being able to gain some education and maybe some social mobility, right? I think what we are trying to do now is reset the system, go back to colonial times, right? But often it's dressed up as, oh no, this is about modernization, right? This is about going forward. We have to see, what the world is going through, all of that. I think we can look at other examples. I think the experimentation with choice, perhaps in the United States, I'm sure Sarah will be able to tell us, right? And what's going on in the education system there now, which is sort of completely in disarray, right? Are maybe lessons for us too to learn from. And I think finally, we've taken the idea that in Sri Lanka, it's the oldest democracy in Asia for granted, right? And I don't think democracies are made just by themselves. And so I think for those of us in the human rights community, it's about human rights, right? It's about a child's right to education. It's not about all children don't have the choice to choose from. Okay, let me choose, a good school that I can pay for, or children don't have that choice. The majority of children in Sri Lanka don't have that choice, right? So it has to be granted to them as right. And I think we are in a very sort of precarious situation in Sri Lanka now, where the common sense has shifted so much that people think that providing fee-living education is the way forward, right? When it's not going to contribute to equality. Those were the early goals of education. And I want to put the question to the floor and for us to think about, will it contribute to democracy, right? And are we not globally and in Sri Lanka at a very precarious place, even in relation to that question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niyanthini.